Right. Have a look at capitalism and LGBT plus oppression, why we need to smash the system. This is a few months ago.
Two speakers. The first speaker will be Hope Ryan, who is a member of the SWP in Birmingham, and the second will be Laura Badasco, an LGBT member in Glasgow. And we're starting off with Hope, so I'll hand over to Hope.
Yeah, thanks, Chioma, and thanks everybody for coming today to this day school. I just want to start really by talking about how important I think is to have the day school today, because as we've seen over the last few years, there's been an increasing wave of hostility towards LGBT plus people. If you look over in Italy, the newly elected fascist Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, said yes to the national family, no to the LGBT lobby, yes to sexual identity, no to gender ideology. And another fascist over in Hungary, Viktor Orban, said we insist marriage in Hungary is between a man and a woman. A father is a man and a mother is a woman. Then they should leave our children alone. Fascists have zeroed in on the idea that in talking about LGBT plus issues is dangerous for children. That is because they are hyper-focused on restricting any form of relationship that is outside the confines of the nuclear family, meaning they want to push all the reforms that LGBT plus people have won over the last few years right back. But these tropes about the LGBT lobby trying to brainwash kids isn't just confined to fascists in Europe, but in the belly of the beast, the USA, we've seen the same kind of moral panic whipped up in the name of culture wars. Ron DeSantis, the current governor of Florida, but is tipped to throw his hat in the ring for the Republican Party presidential primary, passed the Don't Say Gay bill into law. This law would make it impossible for teachers to have discussions in the classrooms around sexuality and gender identity, akin to the Section 28 law introduced by Margaret Thatcher over here. And there's been a similar wave of anti-LGBT plus laws across America. For example, in Tennessee, there have been protests outside the Vanderbilt Hospital, spearheaded by right-wing Daily Wire's Matt Walsh over gender-affirming care for kids. And recently, Tennessee has passed an anti-drag bill banning adult cabaret performances in public spaces. And we can see this thread continue here in the UK as well. We've seen protests against Drag Queen Story Hour, which have links to fascists and the far right, along with protests outside of hotels holding asylum seekers. They suggest that they are protecting women and children from leftists who want to indoctrinate and harm children. But it seems to me that if they were really interested about protecting children, they'd be protesting outside of Buckingham Palace and places like that, not outside Drag Queen Story Hours. Yet these far-right protests don't exist in a vacuum. They are buoyed up by the narrative pushed by the Tories. Prior to Rishi Sunak being PM, both him and the celebrated former Prime Minister Liz Truss was asked during the Talk TV leadership debate whether a trans woman is a woman, and both said no. And more recently, the Tories made moves to block the reform in Scotland that would make it easier for people to be legally recognised by the gender they identify with. It seems like the situation is pretty bleak all around the world, and it is for many LGBT people, as this rhetoric has real-life consequences. But I think it's important that we look at the roots of where this oppression comes from in order to understand it, and more importantly, so we can fight it and win true liberation. This is especially important when most common narratives cite the natural biology for the existence of LGBT plus oppression or the fault of religion. But what I want to argue here is that it was the emergence of class society and then capitalism which cemented the oppression we see today. This understanding demonstrates that all forms of oppression, including LGBT plus oppression, have not always existed. There is nothing innate about it. Therefore, we can fight for a world where it doesn't exist. But in order to do that, we have to tear down the system, the class system that created it, and that means tearing down capitalism itself. It was Friedrich Engels who details in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State how early hunter-gatherer societies, which make up the vast amount of human history, developed into class society, and how the idea of the nuclear family developed with it. Firstly, it's important to point out that Engels refers to hunter-gatherer societies as primitive communism, meaning that although there was a division of labour between women and men, with women mainly doing the gathering and men doing the hunting, both of these tasks had equal standing in society. Neither group had domination over the other, which means they lived in relative equality. And in these societies, there were few controls on sexual relations between group members apart from incest. There were fluid forms of marriage, sexuality and gender. Sexual relations between those of the same sex were very common, especially because the group could only afford to have as many children as the tribe could carry when moving around from place to place. And in these early societies, the idea of someone conscribing to a different gender was commonplace. If agreed by the tribe elders, they could be initiated into another gender role and become, for all social and economic purposes, a different gender. But human beings are unique amongst the animal world, as they are both able to interact with their environment, but also change the world around them, and through that process, change themselves. We find new ways of producing the necessities of life to ease the material conditions of the world, and these new ways of producing create new relations between each member of the group. It is through this process that human beings develop from primitive communism, which, as I said, dominated most of human history, into a class society. Over time, communities began to develop things like the plough that allowed them to settle and farm the land rather than moving around, living hand to mouth. It was this development of agriculture which allowed them to produce more than was immediately needed by the group, but conditions were still precarious during these periods, meaning they were as susceptible as ever to severe weather conditions like droughts and storms. And realising this, there was a necessity for some people within that group to be freed from work in the fields and the manual labour to ensure that the surplus was put aside for the future in case of the occurrence of a severe weather event. It is this process that the family and the state were created. Once a surplus had been achieved, an interest began to rise, which was to pass this wealth down to biological heirs, meaning that men had to know for certain who their children were, meaning monogamy, at least by women, began to be enforced. And over time, as the bounds of the family got stricter and stricter, we started to see the restriction of same-sex relationships and identifying as different genders. The path that leads to LGBT plus oppression that we see today takes quite a complicated route. For example, in early ancient Greece and Rome, there was quite clear evidence that suggests that sex between men and boys were openly embraced, considered quite compatible with things like marriage and children, and in many instances openly celebrated. However, there were contradictions with this view of sexuality. It was not all completely free and accepted. Whilst the sexual behaviours of older men were celebrated, the younger boys were looked down upon. Possibly this is due to the role in which these younger boys played in their sexual relationship. Their willingness to be in submission to older men was considered dishonourable for a future citizen of Rome or Greece. This is due to the submissive role being seen as more feminine, and in this society, women were completely segregated from public life, and their only roles were to look after the household and have children, and so it was not suitable for these young men to be seen as feminine. But from about the 8th century to the 12th century in Western Europe, there was no particular hostility to same-sex relations. It wasn't until the economic crises and plagues of the 14th century when sexual restrictions on sexuality really began. However, this was not necessarily a direct attack on homosexuals, but was a push to force procreative sex. This meant restricting the number of the sexual acts like anal sex, sex with animals, and other forms of sex that would not result in contraception. But these were all punished fairly equally. For example, in Florence in this time period, women and underage boys that submitted to anal sex faced the same punishment, to be whipped naked in the streets. But it was only after industrialisation that we see the modern form of homophobia begin to rise. Industrialisation ripped through all of the old social ties, and thus we saw a change in sexual behaviours. Whereas before, most people lived in the countryside, in their family units, industrialisation forced them into the growing towns and cities. No longer were family households a place of production, so the traditional roles of each family was broken. Both men, women and children were forced to go work in the factories. However, this sent the capitalist class into a panic, as they do not need a strong family, as they need a strong family tie to both produce and socialise the next generation of workers. We begin to see many accounts at the time detailing the brutality of industrialisation by showing the horrific conditions of the factories, mines and the slums. But there was an overt focus on sexual behaviours as well. Many factory commissioners regularly asked questions regarding the chastity of factory girls. They detailed that men would often share close and cramped quarters with other men, and the same goes for women, and depicted in towns and cities as having a prostitute on every corner. So reformers encouraged the nuclear family, modelled on the ruling class idea of the family, and encouraged things like the idea of a family wage, which intended to keep women at home and recreate the ideas between the private and public spheres in which men had to bring home the money, whilst women traditionally looked after the household. The regulation of this role in the home and the public was accompanied by an increase in the regulation of sexual behaviour and homosexuality for the first time, which marked it as specifically deviant. Homosexuality as a term did not arrive until the late 19th century, and although there was words describing sex between men and women that marked it as sinful, it was not until that period that it was seen as an underlying condition or a type of person. Mary McIntosh, a gay rights activist and sociologist, illustrates how this attempt to put people in either camp of homosexual or heterosexual was the purpose to segregate the deviant from others. The creation of a specialised, despised and punished role of homosexual keeps the bulk of society pure, rather the same way a similar treatment of some kinds of criminals help keep the rest of society law-abiding. This strict regulation of sexual behaviour was marked by the trial and subsequent jailing of Oscar Wilde in 1895 for gross indecency, by laws that remained till the 1960s. So as I've outlined, the acceptance of homosexuality and trans people have been radically different throughout the different periods of history, and often reflects the social, political and economic conditions at the time, but fundamentally it's the creation of class society in which antagonisms begin to grow. Capitalism then cements these antagonisms because it needs to socialise and reproduce the next generation of workers. This is why politicians are hyper-focused on things like the family. But LGBT plus oppression is used for something more under capitalism. I talked at the beginning about the current climate we find ourselves in with the growing attacks on LGBT people, which Laura, I think, will go into more. But I think it's important that we understand that the right whips up homophobia and transphobia in order to divide the working class, and the same goes for racism and sexism, because it weakens our strength as a class when we're divided. That's why we cannot get rid of homophobia, transphobia under capitalism, or any form of class society for that matter, and why we have to look to a radically different kind of world in order to fight this oppression. We have to look towards revolution because through struggle we are able to throw off these ideas and replace them with ideas of collectivity and solidarity and a society in which everyone is viewed equal. And I'll finish there and hand.
Right. It was interesting, wasn't it? Hmm. Yeah. Taking all that in. Fueling hate. We also found that anti-trans hate is intensifying. Anti-trans hate, so we're getting used to it in our language. Mm. Oh, death threats. There should be some police reports about that. Anyway, see you later. Bye.